Coming up on Veterans Matters, student veterans from Eastern Illinois University talk about their experiences at the Bataan Memorial Death March. That's coming up next on Veterans Matters.
Well, the Bataan Death March is a memorial march for survivors of the Bataan Death March that took place in the Philippines on April 9th, 1942. Thousands of American servicemen and Philippine servicemen and Philippine civilians were taken captive by an invading Japanese army. After about a heroic 3-month stand, where they were short on supplies, they were malnourished and fatigued, and they did an honorable surrender to the Japanese. And then the result was this nightmarish ordeal of a forced march through harsh conditions, a long subjugation in a prisoner of war camp in brutal conditions, forced labor. A lot of people perished. Many of those that did survive died very shortly after being liberated. So the march is to memorialize their service and suffering, and it's also to honor all veterans and to make sure things like this don't happen again. Well, our team went to honor the memory of 2 people who were affiliated with Eastern Illinois University. One being, and we have the names on our sleeves, William D. Miner was a professor of history here at Eastern Illinois University, and he was a survivor of the Bataan Death March, and he was the Veterans Affairs Coordinator here on campus, the predecessor to our current coordinator. This Dave Piontek was a member of our Black Knights organization, and his father, whose name was Henry William Piontek, was also a survivor.
When I first heard about Bataan, I was like kind of apprehensive, didn't know what it was, the 26.2 miles. I didn't really think of that distance and the conditions in New Mexico. I really wasn't sure what it was all about. Once I did some research and I eventually got there, I was really excited. But at the onset, I wanted to do something to honor veterans. And once I learned more about Bataan, to honor those survivors of the actual Bataan Death March. For me personally, being a cadet and being a future service member, I want to be able to learn, find what it's like to be a leader, and to be able to triumph through some of the things that veterans have gone through in the past. So for me, it was more of a tribute to veterans who have served, and then to the survivors of the actual Bataan Death March.
Whoever's going to speak next?
I was actually a last-minute addition to the team, and I was not familiar with the Bataan Death March up until asking if I wanted to participate or not. And then once I did get involved, I actually found out that my great uncle was actually a survivor of the Bataan Death March as well. So just aside from just the challenge aspect of it and different terrain and things like that, I also felt like essentially dedicating it to my relative as well.
I was going to say, the physical aspect of it. I think first time I was asked, being in graduate school, it was just one of those things where I said, well, sure, I'd like to do that. And then I think it kind of sunk in that I just said I'd, go and do 26.2 miles and, not in local surroundings, but in the desert. And anyway, it all worked out for the best. But for the veterans, when I was an undergraduate here 20 years ago at EIU, we didn't have, I don't believe this veterans organization existed. So it was neat to be a part of, representing EIU. And, most students don't get a chance to do that, to go somewhere and actually represent the university. So that was a pretty good feeling. And the fact that it was a veterans organization to do that, meant quite a bit to me. So.
A great deal of my time in active duty military was spent in the South Pacific, and I was in and around the Philippines extensively. I did jungle and sea survival training in the Philippines and was made very aware of the conditions there and the history of what had happened at Bataan. After leaving the military, I got heavily into fitness and running, and a lot of the runners that I ran with spoke almost with a sense of awe about the Death Valley Marathon they talked about. And it always struck me as something I'd really like to do, but I was a little hesitant on just striking out on my own to do it. It seemed like maybe more than I could accomplish. But then the Veterans Affairs Office and the Black Knights group here on campus actually reached out to me as a veteran and invited me to go. And I was skeptical at first. I didn't think they would just come and swoop somebody up off the campus and take them on a trip like this. But by the time I'd gotten over all my doubts, I found myself marching through the desert, so pretty happy about it. We did have a coordinated schedule of a progressive training that got more difficult as we got nearer the date. But we had to keep in mind that we're all full-time students with families and jobs, and coordinating any type of group training, especially through midterms and such, was difficult. But we started off with just short walks and progressively added it to longer and longer hikes until as a group we did a 16-mile joint hike. We also did different types of calisthenics like squats and lunges as a group, and some of us also went up and down the stairs at the stadium. But we also engaged individually. I know AK, for example, bikes and runs extensively in her own private life. One thing that helped me more than anything was just carrying a heavy backpack around campus all day, every opportunity that I could to just keep wearing that backpack.
I was going to say, as far as my training, I tried not to miss any sessions because I was probably the one that needed it the most. I never did any long distances as far as walking, running, jogging, anything like that. So, I mean, it was unique that no matter what we did, you know, I think that one day it was freezing. I can't remember.
There were some cold days, which didn't really help us for the heat any.
And that's just it. You know, we'd be bundled up with layers of clothing on, and then, you know, going out to a desert condition. So, but I tell you what, it really helped because after the 16-mile mark walk that we did, it seemed like, you know, recuperating from that was pretty good, and then seemed to get your mind ready to do something more.
I was pretty much, like I said, just a last minute addition, and so I tried to get in and participate in as many of the practices as I could. Unfortunately, that only equaled one because of work conflicts and school and everything like that. And it happened to be the one 16-mile walk that we discussed. And so to try and make up for it, I foolishly decided to wear a 20-pound vest for that and soon regretted that. But I think it helped build my endurance a little bit. And then just around work and stuff, I was wearing ankle weights, just little things here and there just to hopefully give me a little bit more endurance for it.
And as she said, I was kind of like the same way. I was actively engaged in things on campus, hold a position at the university, helping residents and being in kind of like a resource on the floor. So I was really actively engaged in that, and I didn't get to make a lot of the training really with anyone as a group. But individually, I had to, you know, take care of it on my own personal time, lifting, running in the gym, etc., walking around campus, things like that. So my individual expectations of this event were kind of slim at the beginning. I was like, not really sure what this is, you know. I've never been to a desert and, you know, run through, you know, mountainous terrain and in the sand. So personally for me, it was just I wanted to make the personal achievement, push myself, kind of get a feel for what it's like as the Bataan survivors went through. So for me, at the end of the day, it was I'm going to push myself as hard as I can so I can kind of simulate just for a little bit how difficult it might have been. So.
As far as I was concerned, I didn't have a lot of expectations. I know initially just by the title, I was actually expecting some sort of like formation march for the entire duration, and then found out that wasn't necessarily the case. I also expected it to be much hotter than it actually was when we were there, and for some of the route, I didn't expect as much pavement as there was, but yeah, I think those are my expectations.
I was going to say, I looked at the website pretty extensively about the course, and they had you know, they have it pretty well laid out, but it's kind of difficult, you know, coming from Illinois to, you know, they have this, they show the elevation rising as the course goes, so you'll have the course down here and what the pavement does, and then it has, you know, like elevation doing these different things, and you know, it's just hard to put that in your mind's eye. And I'll be honest, I thought the elevation would be a little worse because I keep looking, when we landed in El Paso, I kept looking at these mountains going, we're going to have to climb these things. And it wasn't quite that extreme, but, you know, all in all, for me, I guess there was a little bit of, for lack of a better word, fear of just what to expect. And, you know, getting out on the course, it kind of got alleviated. Not that it wasn't difficult, but it wasn't, in your imagination, it could run away with you.
An extensive part of my military training involved covering tough terrain over time, and so I was confident in my ability to cover the terrain. And so for me, it becomes a personal issue to see about how far I can push myself physically, what my limits are. So that's how I approached the course, and I had no idea what to expect from my performance. I'm a lot older than I was when I was doing a lot of these activities before, and I didn't know how my body would stand up. So the actual experience of covering the course for me was more of a personal thing, to push my limits and test myself and just see where I needed improvement.
We left Thursday the 22nd, earlier.
2 a.m.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2 a.m.
Bright and early, and we carpooled to St. Louis and flew out of St. Louis to, what was on the way there?
I think was Dallas on the way
Dallas.
out.
Yeah,
was
the
our
first one was-
stop,
Yeah.
which was Mike Bird's first flight on a fixed-wing aircraft, and watching him
Indeed it
on
was.
the flight was almost as much fun as anything I had on the whole trip.
And
Yeah.
then we went Dallas to hop to El
El
Paso.
Paso on the way out, and then we were picked up by volunteers who drove us out to the missile range, or to Las Cruces, to our hotel.
Then on the way
On
back,
the way back, we actually stopped, we got the ground transportation back to El Paso, and then stopped in Austin, and then in Dallas, and then on to St. Louis, and then drove ourselves back to EIU, where we got back at like 2:30 or 3 o'clock Monday morning, so we're ready for Tuesday classes.
Tuesday
Like
morning.
when-
Tuesday morning.
Tuesday morning,
Tuesday
yeah.
morning.
Tuesday morning.
The one
Yeah, it
thing
was
I
early.
thought was interesting was that on the way out, we were still not that much of a group. We'd done some training together and stuff, so it was everybody was on their best behavior and a little bit withdrawn. And on the way back, it was just nonstop hilarity. That was
Lots of humor.
I think also the fact that it was over helped too. I think some of us had some fear and trepidation before the actual event. So
There's two different aspects to that. The Veterans Administrator that coordinated our schedule had allowed time for us to continue to have study time and personal time and to acclimate to the environment before the race. So we actually arrived on Thursday afternoon on the 22nd, and had some time to just decompress from the travels, and then had most of Friday to study and do on schoolwork before we had to go out to the missile range on Saturday to be registered for the event and to participate into a lot of the memorial activities that were taking place, meet the survivors, and just all of the associated activities that were going on with the march. As to the race itself, we had to leave the hotel about 3 or 4 o'clock Sunday morning to get the, not quite an hour drive out to the missile range. There was a lot of traffic lined up. We had to wait to get in. But we got in there in a timely manner, and I think then we waited until a 7 o'clock start time. The main difficulty there was that in the high desert, the climate's a little dramatic. When we left the hotel, I think it was about 50 to 51 degrees, which was fairly comfortable. And the whole time that we were preparing to get ready for the event, it stayed like that. And then just before sunrise and right after sunrise, the temperature dropped dramatically. And that was the same time they were all crowding us into a starting area. So it was getting colder, and we couldn't move around and stretch. And we were kind of shoulder to shoulder like that for, I think, 35, 45 minutes before they
Before we
started.
actually took
And then
off.
there was such a crowd in front of us that it was another 10 minutes or so before we could get out of the crowd. So with the cold weather and not being able to stretch, there was a lot of people cramping up in the first few miles. So that was one of the challenges at the start.
I was gonna say, one of the other things too that we got to see when we first got there too was the Bataan Memorial there in Las Cruces. And then some of the people also just kind of ventured out of the hotel and just kind of, just familiarized themselves with Las Cruces and spoke to a lot of people. I mean, because there in Las Cruces alone, there were so many people from all over the world and all over the United States that had hotels. I mean, in our specific hotel as well, just trying to see where everyone was from and what everyone's story was and their
Yeah.
reasons.
you got to meet a lot of neat people, but I was worried about acclimating, and I think like on Friday I studied some, and then in the heat of the day went out, walked about 7 miles, around Las Cruces and back to the hotel, just mainly to, try to get used to. It isn't really the heat; it's more of an intense sun. At least to me, it always just felt like the sun was right here when you're walking or running, and you do what you can to get acclimated to that, and it seemed to help.
Happened in the White Sand, or it took place in the White Sands missile range, and the terrain varied. At some points, it was just kind of sand, and then it would be pavement at an incline, and then it was just kind of rolling little hills for a little bit through
Off
sand,
pavement.
yeah, off pavement, loose rock and sand, and things like that, and then you kind of looped, at one point you loop back around, so it'd be declined pavement, and then there was this one section called the pit, which was very, very loose sand, and was probably the most treacherous for any of the participants.
Yeah, I think the the terrain itself is, when you look at the website, or you talk to someone that may have done it, and you really don't get the full effect until you get out there and you're actually on it.
That's probably the best
You know,
way
because
to
when
put
we
it.
took off, you had some nice pavement, you know, and you see a bunch of people on the road, you're like, man, I do this at school, you know, I go take off and run down the road. And then, you know, 1 or 2 miles down there and you're like, oh, wow. You know, then you're running in hard dirt, you go to loose dirt, you go to sand, and then all of a sudden, instead of being on flat ground, you're going in these embankments, you're going up and you're going down. You see the mountains, you're like, no way are we running up there. Sure enough, you're in the mountains, you know, you're going down the side of a mountain. It's very extreme, I thought. Being younger and, you know, in pretty good shape myself, it was still a huge challenge for me. It was very difficult terrain.
It's a sinister laid out course. It starts
It's
off
very
easy,
sinister.
and just at each step of the way, it builds in difficulty, and you're getting more tired as you accomplish each step. You're just glad to see the end of that, and then you realize you're just into something worse. So
Yeah, and then the other factor too is the heat on top of that. You start in the cool of the day, and then, I mean, even the fastest runner is still done around noon, you know, the heat of the day, and then those that walked the course, of course, they had the whole brunt of the heat throughout the whole time on that course. And then, of course, with the pavement, you got the heat that's coming up from the ground as well, from the heat from above. But
And the black shirts we wore as well. Those soaked up a good amount of heat.
they did have rest stops and stuff every few miles, which
Seemed like
helped.
3 or 4 miles.
Water,
Oranges
porta-johns,
and
oranges, bananas, things like that to just keep you motivated, and people along the way just
cheering you on.
cheering you on.
And just to reemphasize, I talked to a trainer because I was pretty much filming as I was doing the thing. So, you know, I'd film a little bit and then keep walking. And I started talking to this trainer from Las Cruces, and who's done a lot of long distance running. And she goes, well, you know, really as far as the altitudes and all that of this course, it isn't so much that, but it's all the gravel, it's all the different, you know, weird textures, and she even said they lay it out basically to mess with your head, and I mean it does a pretty good job. I mean, I think a big part of it is psychological. Of like, I think there was one thing, I never felt like quitting, but you know, we're going and it's in that, I want to say 17-mile mark where you're off the pavement and you can see people going back to White Sands, and you're like, oh good, it's over. And I turned and it was up this big hill, and I was just like, I got to do one of these again. And so, I mean, it's just things like that just keep happening. So.
Yeah, I think a little bit to even put it in some perspective is there was not necessarily professional marathon runners. There may have been some, but of the people that I talked to who have been doing marathons for years, they said it was the most difficult marathon they had ever done. They said you really can't prepare mentally or physically for what you get at the Bataan Death March. I mean, it's just something that you got to show up, and you got to be mentally tough, and you got to fight through it. So.
I actually was surprised as far as the temperature. I was expecting it to be much warmer than it was, and for the heat to be more extreme. It got to 92, I believe, which I don't actually think it felt like it was 92 though, because it was a dry heat.
Yeah,
And
people
that's
say
the key
that,
thing.
but
The difference between dry heat and a humid heat, and the dry heat, yeah, I didn't think it was as.
my concern about the heat was unfounded because we had beautiful conditions. It did get up to
Yeah.
92 by the heat of the day. I think the heat index may have been a little higher, but in the early afternoon, some breezes of about 10 miles an hour or so picked up. And I know that by then, AK and I were headed straight into that headwind on the way back, and it was just wicking the sweat off from us, keeping us cool to where I think that it was a beautiful bright blue day, sunny with light breezes, and the heat just didn't seem to be the worst factor on the course. It was really just the difficulty level of the course that was the main factor.
I was going to say, I believe other participants who had done previous years too said that, like last year, the wind was much more extreme and temperature as well. And those were individuals that we had talked to before we even went on the course. So that's kind of what we were almost expecting a little bit, you know, this wind And there was a little bit of resistance, but I don't think not as much as we expected.
Yeah, and I got to hand it to those three. I mean, I think it was an accidental strategy, but they basically, literally beat the heat. I mean, they were just, down, except I guess the pit. Maybe it was starting to warm up there towards the end.
It was brutal.
But I mean, I moseyed, and it was getting hot towards the end of the day, but it still was more the sunlight than the heat, I guess is the way I'd put it.
Yeah, I was gonna say towards the end of the course, it became more of a dust than a sand too. And you get behind
Yeah.
groups of people that were actually marching or rucking together, and their boots would just kick this up all in your face. And that was one of the difficulties I had, because, I mean, you couldn't see and you're just inhaling all of this. And I still have actually some of that.
Yeah.
We both had opportunities to wash up at one of the facilities there before we got back to the hotel. And then when I got back to the hotel and showered, I was amazed at how long the water just continued to be contaminated with dust that was coming out of my eyes and ears and off my shoulders and everything else. And then I was actually coughing grit, like sand-like grit, out of my lungs for a couple of days after.
Yeah, I still have a little bit.
So I expect if the winds had picked up and there had been any type of dust storms or anything worse than just what was coming off the trail, that would have made it really hard. Some people were wearing covers over their mouths to keep the dust.
I didn't notice that.
And then one group actually wore gas masks the whole course, so that was pretty amazing.
But anyway, you had asked about personal challenges that we had all faced throughout the course. For me, I kind of looked at the start line. I was like, cool, flat ground. So I took off, gung-ho. I wanted to give it a shot. And I actually did do really well the first 8 to 9 miles. Held a good, solid pace. I was passing a ton of people. I got ahead pretty well, and I think that's what helped me do fairly well in the actual race. But my first test came about mile 10, and I was like, all right, I got to slow down a little bit, catch my breath, recollect, gauge the distance, see how I'm going to pace myself. And it clicked right there. I was like, wow, I'm at mile 10. I've got a lot left, so eventually I had some bananas at one of the stops, got some water. I took off again. As soon as I got into the mountains and I was coming around and I got into the sand, about mile 18 is where it just knocks you down. You're like, oh man, I still got a ton left. So you get back on some pavement there briefly, and then you're like, all right, I can do this. And you're going downhill, but at that point, your thighs, your shins, your feet, your calves are smoked. I'd been running a lot of the course, and I was just like, man, I'm not going to be able to do this. I actually thought I was going to quit at some point. I was like, man, this is too tough, But then I would see older gentlemen or younger kids, and they're still trucking. And then I thought of Bataan survivors. I was like, no way am I going to give up on this. So I would truck on, and then you start looking for mile markers to tell you how close you are to done. And you're like, oh, there's 20. And then you'd feel like you were walking or jogging forever, and you're like, man, I was just at 20. I think I missed 3 or 4 mile markers. Nope, 21.
Exactly. That was a weird phenomenon.
So you're like, there's no way I'm gonna finish this. And then you just keep going. You get to the point where, like for me, walking hurt as bad as running. So towards the end, I was like, if I'm just gonna hurt, I might as well be running the dang thing. So it got to mile 26. Some gentleman was running behind me. And he smacked me on the rear, and he's like, roll, Tide, roll. He was super motivating. He was yelling the whole way, and I just picked it up from there and ran across the finish line. But there was multiple tests and challenges the whole way through. You just had to dig in and drive on. So, well, there were various things put out. I remember at one point hearing there being 8,000 plus registers for the event. I know in one of the categories we all participated in, there was at least 1,858 people running it. So there were people from the civilian world. There were people that were, active duty military, National Guard military, Reserve military. There were ROTC cadets from all over the country. There was foreign military. You had German military, British, New Zealand, Canadian. There were people from like all walks of our country, and then people from the international community as well.
Law enforcement as well as military.
Yeah, U.S. Marshals.
Yeah, we talked to
Then
Dallas
the
police.
People who had affiliations with survivors or family members that had been survivors were there. The diversity of the participants was a wider range as you can imagine, from 9, 10-year-old young.
Yeah,
men
it surprised me how
children
many
walking
kids
in
there were.
To, one guy was well past 80, walking with ski poles through the course. So there was a quadruple amputee that did the course in 5 hours. So just anything you can imagine, it was there.
There was a gentleman, I remember I was behind, and I think I have film footage of it, but it said made in the USA in 1928.
Yeah.
So, he was doing it. And I guess the beginning of the course, at some point, there's a halfway or a point where they turn. So if there were people did the 13 mile, they go turn. So it's kind of neat that maybe there was I don't know, from what the estimates you guys were coming up with, maybe there was like 1,500 or so that did the 13 mile. I don't know.
I'm not quite sure how many did the 13.
It didn't have it listed.
Yeah, I know like in our particular civilian light category, they're about, you know, a little over 1,500, around 1,800 altogether as far as ones that completed the actual 26.2, and that being either with 35 pounds or more on their back or in a team or individual. They were about 4,400, I believe is what. Yeah, 4,400.
I think it's really great that all those people start together. So I mean, that was a butterfly moment when the sun's coming up and you can, you know, see the mountains and all that and the flags in the background and you know, 7,000 plus people start off on this thing and you know, you're part of it. You know, it's just like you're part of the lifeblood of it. And you know, I enjoyed. I was coming. I think there was a lot of people that didn't go to EIU and have our, you know, hardy training. So I was in behind, and I saw a lot of people on the side, and it was interesting because, you know, not to rub it in, but like Citadel, a lot of the St. Louis ROTC. I mean, these are also people carrying heavy packs in fairness to them. But, you know, you did get to see all the teams, you know, throughout the country in that. And, you know, it was pretty neat as far as that goes, that it was a big national, international event.